The elevator door slid open with a hushed sigh, releasing Henry Clark into the 38th floor of his empire. The offices stretched out like an extension of his will-glass walls, black leather chairs, a view of the city's skyline that seemed to bow under his gaze. Assistants scurried in his wake, tablets clutched like lifelines, reciting schedules and numbers in clipped voices. He didn't slow for them. He never did. Henry didn't walk through his company. He cut through it, a sharp blade of purpose, moving with the precision of a man who understood the value of seconds. He was the kind of leader who didn't believe in luck. Markets were numbers. People were assets. Negotiations were wars fought not with fists, but with strategy, timing, and the right leverage applied at the exact right moment. And Henry Clark was always on time. He was a man who dined at his desk, who never left a voicemail because waiting was inefficiency, who trained his executives to speak in bullet points and never indulge in small talk. Emotion, he told them, was a liability. Compassion diluted results. In his world, warmth was weakness, and weakness didn't close deals. That day had unfolded no differently than 100 before it. A breakfast that doubled as a performance review. 3 calls before lunch, each one more aggressive than the last, his voice measured and sharp, corralling stubborn investors into compliance. He thrived on the clash of wills. By 5 o'clock, his body was exhausted, but his mind hummed with calculations, projections, lines of strategy strung together in clean, unbreakable logic. He lived for it, the order, the predictability of success, the feeling that he had the world in the palm of his hand. The town car waited, as it always did, engine idling, a driver ready to deliver him back to the penthouse where he could review numbers. Late into the night, yet as he settled into the back seat, something restless stirred in him, a faint discordant note in the symphony of routine. He told the driver to take a different turn, one that veered toward the quieter streets on the city's edge. No destination, no need, just habit, he told himself. Sometimes, without realizing, he slipped into these detours. It was nothing he would later insist it was nothing. A corner supermarket he had stepped into a dozen times before, never for long. He didn't even need much, perhaps water, perhaps nothing at all. But he pushed open the glass door anyway, the bell above tinkling like an intrusion into the order of his evening. The store smelled of linoleum and oranges, faint detergent clinging to the air. He moved briskly down the aisles, his hands empty, his expression as severe as ever. But then he stopped. It wasn't the product displays or the fluorescent lights. It was something else, something he couldn't immediately identify, that snagged him mid-stride. He lingered. For a man like Henry Clark, lingering was rare, almost unnatural. His life was momentum, one appointment slamming into the next. Yet here, for reasons he couldn't name, he hesitated. A strange quiet seemed to press at the edges of the candy aisle. He stood at the end of it, just breathing in that silence, though he couldn't yet see why it unnerved him. His pulse shifted slightly, not in alarm, but in something close to recognition, though of what? He didn't know. For the briefest moment, Henry Clark, CEO, strategist, unbending ruler of numbers, felt the unfamiliar tug of something outside the confines of logic, and he did not move on, asterisk under the harsh glow of fluorescent bulbs. Henry Clark found himself standing at the threshold of the candy aisle. It should have been nothing an aisle like any other, shelves stacked with bright wrappers, sugar designed to tempt children and weary adults alike. He almost turned away, almost, but then his eyes caught on something that didn't belong in the usual blur of packaging and product, too. Figures, small, motionless, they were standing so still it was as if the world around them had been paused. To little girls, shoulder to shoulder, facing the shelf of chocolate bars as though they were staring at a horizon no one else could see. Their hair was long and thick, waves of dark brown that reached almost to the middle of their backs, catching faint glints of the overhead light. They didn't fidget. They didn't speak. They didn't even reach for the candy. They simply looked. Henry slowed, a rare thing for him. In his world, stillness meant inefficiency, a flaw in motion. But here, in the frozen hush of this aisle, stillness felt heavier than movement. It was a silence that seemed learned, not chosen like they had been taught that wanting was dangerous. In all his years, he'd seen children in stores, hundreds of them, crying, tugging at sleeves, pleading for sweets with sticky hands and loud voices. He had dismissed them all with the same cold indifference. But these girls were different. They weren't begging. They weren't even whispering. They looked like hunger given form. fragile bodies anchored only by the gravity of chocolate bars they dared not touch. His chest tightened unexpectedly, and he almost laughed at himself. Henry Clark, CEO, conqueror of mergers, undone by two children standing in a grocery store. He tried to rationalize it, to explain the strange weight pressing on him. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the fluorescent lighting. But he knew better. This wasn't his imagination. Something in this aisle demanded his attention. He approached slowly, his footsteps oddly loud against the tiled floor. The girls didn't turn. Not until he was nearly beside them did one of them, slightly taller, wearing a pale pink sweater frayed at the cuff, tilt her head up. Her eyes were startling, impossibly blue, so clear they seemed to strip away the layers of armor he wore. When she spoke, her voice was so soft it barely reached him. "No, we're just hungry." The words hit harder than any corporate betrayal, sharper than any negotiation. Not dramatic, not pleading, just a plain fact. He blinked, as though his brain needed time to register it. Asterisk, the second girl shifted, tugging the hem of her oversized blue hoodie with trembling fingers. She didn't look up right away. When she finally did, her gaze didn't waver, but her words slid into him with quiet finality. "They left." Henry's mind stalled. "They left? Who?" "Parents, guardians." Whoever was supposed to be watching them clearly wasn't here. He looked around quickly, up and down the aisle, toward the registers, past the fruit displays. Nothing. No adults hovering nearby. No shopping cart abandoned at the end of the row. No sign that these belonged to anyone at all. The air felt colder. His instincts, the ones honed at boardrooms and battlefields of finance, told him this was none of his concern. Children without supervision weren't his responsibility. He should walk away. He should leave this to someone else. But his feet didn't move. He couldn't. Something had taken root in him. Something foreign. Something unwelcome. The pull of responsibility not measured in profit, but in humanity. For the first time in years, Henry crouched, lowering himself to their level. His voice, so often sharp and commanding, softened against his will. "Where are your parents?" The girl in blue's small hands trembled harder, but her voice remained steady, almost rehearsed. "They left," she repeated. And in that moment, Henry Clark, the man who prided himself on being untouchable, unshakable, felt a crack split through his carefully constructed world. Asterisk, Henry rose slowly, his knees stiff from crouching, but the weight pressing against his chest wasn't from age or posture. It was from the words that clung to him like a shadow. "They left." The echo followed him as he straightened, as if the aisle itself had absorbed the truth and whispered it back at him. For a long, charged moment, he stood over them, torn between the man he had always been and the man these two pairs of eyes demanded him to become. He could walk away. Logic screamed for it. His empire thrived on clean lines, on boundaries unblurred. These children were a complication, a variable, a distraction. Yet, as he looked at the trembling hands clutching the hem of a hoodie too large for its owner, something inside him shifted. Without thinking, Henry reached for a basket. His movements were precise, almost mechanical at first. Juice, sandwiches, a pack of apples, water bottles. He added them all with the same efficiency he used in board meetings, his mind cataloging and calculating. But then, his hand hovered over the candy shelf, the very place where the girl's eyes had anchored themselves. He plucked for chocolate bars and set them carefully into the basket. When he returned, the girls hadn't moved. Their wide eyes followed the basket as though it contained treasure stolen from myth. Henry lowered it to their level. "Take it," he said quietly, surprised at the gentleness in his tone. They didn't move, didn't believe. "Asterisk, it's for you," he added, pushing the bag handles toward them. His hand brushed against the smaller girl's fingers, and she flinched, not from fear, but from disbelief. Slowly, reverently, as if afraid it might vanish, they took the bags. Their silence cracked. Just barely, an almost invisible smile flickered across the girl in Pink's lips. Fragile as glass. Asterisk, Henry cleared his throat, suddenly restless, as though kindness was an ill-fitting suit he didn't know how to wear. He guided them toward the front, his tall frame shielding their smaller ones. The cashier blinked when she saw the girls, her eyes darting to Henry, waiting for protocol, waiting for him to explain. He didn't. He simply pulled out a black card, slid it across the counter, and murmured, "Ignore procedure. Just ring it up." The dusk outside hit them with a rush of cold air. The smaller girl shivered, her thin arms curling inward. Without pause, Henry shrugged out of his jacket. It was tailored Italian wool, worth more than most people's rent. He draped it over her shoulders anyway, surprised by his own instinct. The jacket dwarfed her, swallowing her frame, but she pulled it close like armor, her blue eyes flicking up to him with something dangerously close to trust. And there, under the weak light of a flickering street lamp, Henry felt at the crumbling of walls he had spent decades building. He had led armies of executives, crushed rivals, built an empire of cold precision. Yet he had never once felt the peculiar terror that now knotted in his gut, the awareness that these two children had no one else. He looked down the street, scanning shadows, half expecting someone to appear and claim them. But the sidewalk was empty. The world moved on, cars groaning by, people shuffling past, oblivious. The girls were invisible to everyone else. Everyone but him. And Henry Clark, for the first time in his calculated life, understood what it meant to be trapped not by contracts or negotiations, but by a moral gravity that no amount of logic could defy. The night pressed heavier as Henry guided the girls away from the store, the plastic bags swinging lightly from their small hands, their silence louder than any boardroom battle he had ever fought. The street was nearly empty, save for a flickering street lamp and the occasional hum of passing cars. But Henry's mind felt crowded full of questions he couldn't ask and answers he wasn't sure he wanted. He crouched slightly, trying to meet their gaze, though neither seemed eager to speak. "Where do you live?" His voice was soft, careful, as though the wrong tone might break them. The girl in the pink sweater bit her lip, glancing at her sister before whispering, "We don't." Henry froze. He searched their faces for exaggeration, for the kind of drama children invented. But there was none, just calm acceptance, spoken like a fact they had long grown used to. His chest tightened. "What about your parents?" The taller girl's fingers tightened on the bag handle, knuckles pale. The one in the oversized hoodie finally looked at him again, her eyes vast oceans of blue. "They left a while ago." The words carried no tremor, but her hands betrayed her trembling against the hem of fabric too big for her tiny frame. Henry felt an ache he didn't recognize. In his world, leaving was a business strategy. Employees left, partners left, clients left. You cut ties, you moved forward, you rebuilt. But this wasn't strategy. This was abandonment, raw and merciless. He glanced at the darkening sky, at the shadows stretching long across the street. A thought pierced him. How long have they been out here alone? He imagined them navigating alleys, hiding from strangers, shrinking into corners when the world grew too loud. No tantrums, no tears, only silence, the silence of children who had learned that asking was useless. Henry straightened, the decision warring inside him. Logic told him this wasn't his responsibility. Call child services. Call the police. Hand them off and walk away. That was the efficient solution. That was the Clark way. Problems were meant to be solved, not felt. Yet even as he thought it, the image of their stillness in the candy aisle replayed in his mind, like a brand burned into memory. He couldn't do it. Not this time. "Come on," he said finally, gesturing to his car. His driver blinked in surprise as Henry opened the door himself, ushering the two girls inside. They hesitated at first, glancing at one another, then climbed in without a word. The car, usually a vessel of cold silence and strategic calls, suddenly felt different, filled with the quiet breathing of two children, and the unspoken weight of trust. As the city lights blurred past the tinted windows, Henry studied them in the dim glow. They unwrapped sandwiches slowly, carefully, as though expecting them to be taken away at any moment. Their hunger was desperate, yet restrained, as if they had learned to eat in silence too. Henry's hand twitched against his knee. He wanted to ask more questions, names, ages, where they had slept last night, but the words tangled in his throat. He wasn't used to speaking without an agenda. He wasn't used to carrying what the answer might do to him. For the first time in years, Henry Clark felt something he couldn't categorize, quantify, or control: helplessness. The man who built empires with ruthless efficiency sat across from the small strangers and realized that no strategy could fix what had been broken in their lives. The driver cleared his throat softly. "Sir, where to?" Henry hesitated, staring out at the city stretching endlessly before him. His penthouse tower loomed in the distance, sleek and glassy, a monument to everything he had built. It had never felt so hollow. He turned back to the girls. One of them had already dozed off against the leather seat, clutching his jacket like it was the only safe thing in the world. He gave the driver an address that surprised even himself. Not the penthouse, not the office, Somewhere quieter, somewhere he hadn't been in years. As the car pulled away, Henry felt the ground shift beneath him. His empire had always been built on rules, but tonight, the silent little girls were rewriting every single one. Asterisk, the car glided through the city like a dark vessel, carrying 3 unlikely passengers into an uncertain night. Henry sat rigid, his gaze fixed on the window, though his reflection betrayed him jaw-tight. Eyes restless, every line of his face etched with a question he couldn't answer. He had spent his life calculating risk, predicting outcomes, dictating the course of empires. But now, across from him, the small girls sat with their knees drawn close, clutching plastic bags of food like lifelines. And no formula in the world could tell him what to do next. The older one, pink sweater, blue eyes sharp with unspent tears, kept glancing at him between bites of her sandwich. The younger, wrapped in his oversized jacket, had drifted half into sleep, her head lolling gently against the window, lips sticky with chocolate. They looked fragile and fierce at once, like survivors who had already seen too much. Henry's phone buzzed against his pocket. A calendar reminder lit up the screen. Merger strategy call. Critical. His empire waited for him, polished and merciless. He could almost hear the voices of his board. Focus, Henry. Stay sharp. Distractions cost millions. He silenced the phone. For the first time in his career, he ignored the call. Sir, his driver asked again, cautious, as if sensing the strange weight inside the car. Should I take you home? Asterisk, Henry opened his mouth, then shut it. Home, a penthouse stacked with imported art, wine cellars, Italian marble, every symbol of wealth except the one thing that mattered tonight: safety. For these girls, his fortress in the sky would be nothing but another unfamiliar cage, not home. Henry said finally. His voice was low, deliberate. Just drive. I'll tell you where to stop. The driver nodded and fell silent. As the cityscape gave way to quieter streets, Henry leaned forward. What are your names? The older one hesitated, chewing carefully as though names were currency she couldn't afford to spend. Finally, she whispered, Leela. Her voice was almost too soft to hear. Henry looked to the younger girl. She stirred under the weight of his gaze, tugging the jacket tighter before murmuring, Maya. Leela and Maya. Names like fragile threads binding them to the world. Do you have somewhere safe? Henry asked carefully. He wasn't sure what answer he expected, but the shake of Lila's head pierced him anyway. We had a place, she said after a pause. But it wasn't good. We left. It's better out here. Better. On the streets. The logic of it rattled him. How cruel must a place be that sleeping under neon signs and cold air felt safer than staying? Henry's stomach turned. He thought of social workers, government shelters, the polite but detached system that sorted children into files and categories. He could hand them over, and maybe it would be fine. Maybe. But he saw the way Lila's body tensed at the thought, the fear crouching behind her quiet eyes. We'll be separated, that fear seemed to whisper. We'll disappear from each other. Henry had always trusted systems. But tonight, he didn't trust this one. His driver slowed at a light, and Henry caught sight of a black SUV in the side mirror. It had been behind them for several blocks now, keeping distance but never turning away. He narrowed his eyes. Coincidence or something else? Layla must have noticed his change in posture, because she suddenly sat straighter, her small hand gripping Maya's. Henry turned to her. Do you know that car? Asterisk, her eyes flickered, then dropped. Silence, the kind of silence that screamed yes. Henry's pulse quickened. A rival in business was predictable: contracts, clauses, legal battles. But this was the kind of threat you could now negotiate. He leaned forward, his voice sharp now. Change course. Don't make it obvious. The driver obeyed, weaving through side streets, but the SUV stayed behind. Patient and steady, Henry's mind raced, a storm of possibilities. Whoever left these girls hadn't truly let them go, and whoever wanted them back might not be coming with good intentions. As the car picked up speed, Henry realized the truth he'd been avoiding since the candy aisle. He was already entangled. Whether he liked it or not, these girls weren't just strangers anymore. They were under his protection, and Henry Clark, the man who had built his life on control, was about to enter the one kind of war he'd never fought before. The black SUV lingered in the rearview like a predator circling prey. It never surged forward recklessly, never tried to overtake. It simply followed, always just far enough back to make its presence undeniable. Henry's pulse sharpened into a steady drumbeat, every thud echoing with the truth he had spent his life ignoring. There were problems. Money couldn't bury, contracts couldn't contain, and lawyers couldn't outmaneuver. This wasn't business. This was something primal, sir, his driver said carefully, eyes flicking between mirrors. They've been behind us since the supermarket. I know, Henry muttered. His gaze slid to the girls. Leela clutched Maya's hand so tightly their knuckles whitened. They weren't surprised. Fear wasn't new to them. This wasn't the panic of children caught in something unexpected. This was recognition. Who are they? Henry asked, his voice low, deliberate. Lila's lips parted, then closed again. She looked out the window as if the night itself might offer protection. Maya stirred in his jacket, her tiny voice muffled but certain. We can't go back. The words cracked something inside Henry. They weren't pleading for candy anymore. They weren't even asking for help. They were declaring survival. He leaned forward sharply. Lose them? Now. The driver nodded, pressing his foot down. The car lunged forward, weaving between late-night traffic. Henry felt the girls tense, their bodies pressing closer together as though bracing against an impact. The SUV mirrored every turn. Henry's hand hovered over his phone, instinct urging him to call someone, police, security, anyone. But another thought gnawed at him. What if calling the system only delivered them straight back to whoever they were running from? He built his empire on control, and now control was slipping through his fingers like water. Sir, we can take the river road, lose them in the industrial stretch. Do it. The city blurred into shadows and steel. Warehouses loomed, deserted lots yawning open under the glow of broken lamps. The SUV hung back, relentless, a shadow stitched to their tail. The silence in the car was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Maya's uneven breathing. Henry turned to Leela, his voice gentler this time. Who are they, Leela? She finally met his eyes. There was no childlike innocence there, only the wary calculation of someone who had been forced to grow up too soon. Bad people, she whispered. They said they'd take us if we didn't. If we didn't. She stopped, swallowing the rest. Her gaze flicked to Maya, as though the words were poison she couldn't let her sister hear. Henry clenched his jaw. Every instinct he had honed in decades of business told him to assess risk, to cut ties, to protect his assets first. But for the first time, the assets weren't numbers or contracts. They were the fragile lives. The driver swung the car sharply, cutting down a narrow lane between the factories. Tires screeched. The SUV followed, its headlights spilling across cracked brick walls. The chase wasn't wild. It was methodical, like a predator herding its prey into a corner. Henry's phone buzzed again, this time his head of operations, no doubt demanding his presence for the merger call. He stared at the screen, thumb hovering over answer, before tossing the phone aside. For the first time, he understood the hollow nature of his empire. What good were millions when two children in his backseat were about to be dragged back into the hands of people who spoke in threats? The car burst into an open stretch by the river. Water glistened black and merciless under the moonlight. The SUV cut its lights, sliding closer, as if preparing to make its move. Henry leaned forward, his voice razor sharp. If they force us to stop, don't wait for me. You keep driving. You get them out. The driver's eyes widened in the mirror. And you, sir? Henry glanced at the girls, his jacket slipping from Maya's shoulders onto the seat between them. I'll handle it. The word shocked even him. He was Henry Clark, the man who thrived on structure, who calculated risk down to decimals. He wasn't the kind of man who threw himself into chaos for strangers. And yet, in the hollow echo of his voice, he knew it was true. The SUV surged closer, closing the gap, its engine growling like a beast ready to strike. Henry's hand tightened into a fist. For the first time in his carefully constructed life, the battle ahead wasn't about profit margins or market dominance. It was about the little girls who had no one else, and Henry Clark, the man who had built an empire out of fear and respect, was about to learn what it meant to fight for something far greater. Asterisk, the SUV's headlights cut through the night like knives, closing the gap with every second. The driver swerved, engine roaring, but the river road offered few escapes. Henry's pulse thundered. He wasn't a man who let adrenaline dictate him. His power came from calculation, from control, but tonight calculation was useless. Tonight, instinct was king. Hold on, the driver warned, jerking the wheel into a sudden turn down an unlit service road. The girls tumbled against the leather seat, clutching each other, their bags of food spilling open. Candy bars skittered across the floor like fallen coins. The SUV followed, relentless, stopped the car. Henry ordered suddenly. The driver's eyes darted to him in disbelief. "Sir, if we, now," Henry barked, the command ringing with the same authority that had bent investors to his will. Tires screamed against gravel as the sedan skidded to a halt. Dust rose, curling into the beams of the SUV as it pulled up, idling just a few yards back. Its engine rumbled like a beast waiting to pounce. The driver's hands clenched the wheel, but Henry was already moving. He opened the door, stepping into the night air, the chill slicing through his shirt. The SUV door opened out from the shadows. A man emerged, broad-shouldered, scar tracing his jaw, a smile like a blade. He moved with the ease of someone who owned fear, who wore intimidation like a second skin. Two more shapes flanked him, silent, faceless in the dark. "Clark," the man drawled, his voice carrying a rough amusement. "Didn't expect to see you caught up in this." Henry's eyes narrowed. "You know me. Oh, everyone knows you. The ruthless genius. The man who makes entire companies vanish with a signature." The man stepped closer, his gaze sliding to the car behind Henry. "But tonight, you've got something that belongs to me." The words sliced through the night. Henry didn't move. Behind him, he could hear Lila's sharp inhale, Maya's whimper muffled against her sister's shoulder. "They're not yours," Henry said, his tone icy, even as something raw burned beneath it. The man's smile widened. "Not mine? You think they're yours, Clark? That's rich. They're leverage. Nothing more. They were left to settle a debt, and debts always get collected." The world tilted. A debt, abandoned not out of carelessness, but as currency. The logic of it made Henry's stomach turn. In his empire, debts were numbers, clean and negotiable. But this, using children as bargaining chips. Even for Henry, who had gutted rivals and clawed his way to power, this was unthinkable. Asterisk, he took a step forward, his shadow stretching into the SUV's light. "You're not taking them," the man chuckled, dark and low. "You think this is your choice?" Henry didn't flinch. He had stared down billion-dollar rivals without blinking. But tonight, the stakes weren't contracts, they were to trembling children who had no shield but him. For the first time, Henry Clark wasn't fighting for profit. He was fighting for something he couldn't quantify. And then Lila's voice broke through the tension. Thin, shaking, but fierce. "Don't let him take us." Henry's chest constricted. He turned slightly, catching her eyes in the back seat. There it was, trust. Terrifying, unshakable trust. She had given it to him without hesitation, and he could not betray it. The man's smirk faltered. "Why risk your neck for the kids you don't even know?" The question hung in the night, heavy, poisonous. And then the truth struck Henry with the force of a hammer. The eyes, those impossible blue eyes that had cut through him in the candy aisle. He had seen them before years ago, staring out from a face he had once loved and left behind. A woman whose life he had torn apart in his climb to power. He hadn't thought of her in years. He had buried her memory beneath contracts and concrete. But here, standing before him, the past had returned in the form of two little girls with her hair, her eyes, her silence. They weren't strangers. They were his. His throat tightened, but his voice came out steady, sharper than steel. "Because they're mine." The words cracked the night open, shocking even himself. The man across from him blinked, thrown off his rhythm. Henry stepped forward again, taller, stronger. His presence filling the space with a new kind of authority, one not born from fear, but from claim, from blood. The SUV rumbled behind the scarred man, but he didn't move. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. Henry didn't wait. He turned his head slightly, addressing his driver, without taking his eyes off the threat. "Get them out of here." Asterisk, the engine roared as the car lurched forward, carrying Lila and Maya into the dark. Henry stood his ground, alone under the glow of headlights, the past and future colliding in his chest. For the first time in his life, the strict millionaire CEO wasn't protecting an empire. He was protecting family Dodd, and he knew, with bone-deep certainty, that he would burn the world before letting anyone take them again.